Well, wouldn't you know, we're back here with a movie night for the first time in how long? I don't even remember, but this will be episode 9, I think. Let me scroll down. Episode 8 was 1001 Nights. This is the first one since then. 1001 Nights at 800. Now, that would be something. 108 views right now. 2 months ago. Hold on, I'm going to get the exact date here so we can all stew in our procrastination here. And by our, I mean mine, but you're getting the blame too, chat. On January the 20th. It's now March the 26th when I'm recording this, and probably later when you're hearing this. My goodness gracious me. But yes, movie night, we'll keep on going, you know? It'll never die. We'll watch a movie every once in a while and do one. Actually, I do want to make it more consistent. Will it be every week? Almost certainly not. You've learnt your lesson by now. Apocalypse Now was 7, right? Yeah, and that was like a month and a bit before that. So we haven't exactly been consistent here, but here we are today to consistently talk about Japan's longest day, 1967, right? Hold on, now I gotta go over to Twitter and check that. We're prepared for things. I actually do have notes today. 1967 is indeed the case. Who was complaining on one of the uploads that I'm only doing movies nobody's heard of, and that's Base. That filled me with validation, and I felt really cool. We ain't doing these fucking normie movies. I nearly choked while saying it. That's how disgusted I am with this normie nonsense. But yeah, this movie is hard to find. On the YouTube trailer, there's like people asking where to watch it because they can't find it. I found a fucking torrent somewhere. I don't remember where, because I downloaded it like a month ago and then procrastinated again, even more so in watching it. So you can find it. Just type in wherever you get your torrents, your movies, Japan's Longest Day 1997. Not 97, 67. It is in black and white too. We're turning it, and you gotta read subtitles, and it's not animated. Oh my goodness, the audience is having a fucking rage fit right now. But the reason, I think we said last time that we were doing this next. In fact, I'm almost certain. But the reason we're watching this movie is because it was mentioned for like 30 seconds in the the Anno problem. It's not Dilemma, is it? Might be. No, I think it's just the Hideaki Anno problem. Because I've since gone back and watched it. Well, he described it in that initial video, and what initially perked my interest was that he basically said it was the telling of the last day of the war in Japan, and basically them deciding to surrender in a bunch of boardrooms and stuff like that. So I was like, Japanese madmen about the war? That sounds great. It wasn't really like that at all. And a boardroom is sort of just, I guess it's technically a boardroom, but it's not like a business boardroom. We'll explain more as we progress. But yeah, so that initially perked my interest, and I was like, alright, let's watch this movie. Seems interesting. World War II stuff, history stuff. I vaguely like all these things. Is this the first Japanese non-animated movie I've ever seen? I think so. I think one of those like shitty live-action 80s Dragon Ball movies was like a dub over. And I definitely didn't notice as a kid. But if that counts. But aren't those like Korean or something? And that's like the fun fact about those movies. So maybe this is the first live action Japanese movie I've ever seen. Crazy. So we can add that to our what do you call it? Flexing list, bragging list. We've got the bragging rights of that. But yes, I'm scrambling. We're good with our words today. Through Letterboxd right now to try and get the fucking thing. I hate how it sorts things initially by release date. Like, what the fuck? Sort them by my ranking and when rated. There we go. Newest first. I ended up settling on 3.5 stars for Japan's Longest Day. It is, 2 hours and a half long at least? I think 2 hours, 157 minutes. It's a very long movie, and it definitely feels long in parts. And the monotony is kind of part of the point, as we'll talk more about as we progress. But getting back to the Steven thing, so I initially saw it in that video, and I was like, oh, that sounds interesting as fuck. We've been stumbling over our words, and now we've started yawning. This is the cavalcade of successful unscripted videos here on the secondary ENT channel. So yeah, I've since gone back to watch it, and the actual context of it in the video is Anno talking about it, and I think it's Anno and the assistant director on the rebuilds, the Fooly Cooly dude. You know the fella. Fuck, I could remember his name if I really thought about it, but I ain't thinking about it. Where they sort of both talk about how this movie sort of influenced them and how much they like it. Especially in terms of Shin Godzilla, which, as I understand, is a Godzilla movie more about the, like, behind-the-scenes stuff rather than actually fighting Godzilla, etc. And so, yeah, because it's in that portion of the Steven video, because that Steven video is broken down into every project Anno worked on and sort of the behind-the-scenes and authorship legacy that runs through them all. So that's all interesting. This is also like a 35th or 25th anniversary Toho project. Toho is something I vaguely hear talked about in anime and stuff. Is that in the DBZ abridged fucking, not signature, but pre-warning at the beginning? Toho Animation, Fuji Animation, something like that. So they're a big Japanese media company is the point. And this was like their special that they made on their 35th anniversary or something. If you delve into the dark depths of letterboxd reviews here, some people provide little histories with it too about how the 60s, when Japan was in a big upswing economically, was the perfect time to revisit its past or whatever, because Japan, as I understand it, from a very layman's perspective, goes through an extremely not turbulent, but like an extreme juxtaposition for who they are pre and during World War II and who they are afterwards, where they've sort of become a much more secular, sort of definitely American influenced type like government and structure and things like that, and sort of their attitudes versus them being like imperial like craziness beforehand. But yeah, so it's sort of like interesting and things like that. An interesting set piece in history for the events of the plot to be set in. You understand, the fucking war's ending. The biggest war. The World War II one. The last World War. Yet. Ooh, isn't that scary? So let me bring up my notes, because I didn't make notes for this one. Where do we want to go besides the history and stuff? The Anno influence. Oh, and in the Steven video, the interview he pulls from in that video talks about how Anno's like anti-war sentiment or whatever is directly derived from this movie, which you can definitely see if you watch the movie. Logistics and meetings and bureaucracy, thinking of it as ceremony. This is sort of the Shin Godzilla supposed influence here, and it is evident a little bit in Eva. Sort of I bring this up all the time. Is it Ramseel? Or am I thinking of the fucking Attack on Titan dude? The big pyramid angel that they beat at the end of episode 6. For the next like 3 or 4 episodes, whenever you get wide shots of this city, you see it slowly being deconstructed by sort of like the logistics of Nerve and that department as they slowly break down the corpse, and that's just like such a neat little detail. And Ava has a bunch of stuff, like logistical stuff like that, where there is a lot of logistical like mecha porn in there for the people that really care about that stuff, which I'm vaguely interested in, I guess, and sort of yeah, and that's a big part of this movie, where a lot of the plot is sort of based around them editing a script for the Emperor's surrender, and how important certain wordings and phrases are to the different like departments, and how to send a clear message but also not make Japan look weak, and try to skirt around the fact that they're surrendering, even though a lot of their cultural zeitgeist and girth comes from fighting to the last man and kamikaze stuff, etc. It's an interesting dynamic that's at play there. And there is a line in the movie saying, where like, there's like these 2 characters. I'm not going to remember nearly any characters' names in this. I have some, actually. It's not Ayanami, but Anami is the, they're not governors of war. Minister of War is what they're called. And then Eder's the pretty revolutionary dude who's looking all cool as he's looking down at like burning pan flips and wants his whole department to commit, we'll just call it suicide, because I don't want to sound like a fucking weeb. Mass honorable suicide. Sempoku or whatever it's called. See, I could say it easily in my head, and I could say it easily if we were off stream, but since we're recording, I can't say the word. Just like I couldn't say the Minister of War's name just now. But nonetheless, Harakawa is the main bad guy too. But there's a line where two of the characters that are sort of the secretaries, I think, who sort of do all the grunt work, I guess. But they're sort of like, we see them as sort of, not outsiders, but they sort of talk about, they sometimes give exposition about what's going on with the ministers, but they're not as ego wrapped up in it. So they sort of offer a more sort of a third party or objective perspective that I think is supposed to resonate and therefore be, what do you call it when it's a reliable narrator for exposition, is what I'm trying to say. But at some point, I think it's one of them that says like, oh, they're having a meeting about the surrender of the war after it's already been like decided, and one of the dudes is like, why would they need to do that? And the other dude is like, well, it's basically ceremonial. Or it's you should think of it as ceremony, where it's sort of like, well, now sort of like if you're doing like a ceremonial grieving process or something, you sort of do these steps, where even if it is sort of redundant, it is part of the grieving process. And a lot of this movie is sort of about the grief of the dying empire of Japan. There's a lot of crying. Which we'll get to. I have a dot point about that. So I guess I should, because nobody listening to this has probably seen the movie, except Miller, if he actually does watch it, and then watch the review. Sometimes he forgets to do that, I think. The movie is basically about high levels of government conversation about whether or not they should accept, there's like a thing. The Allies are winning, Hitler's dead, the Western Front in Europe, I'm pretty sure, is wrapped up pretty conclusively. And the war in the Pacific is still going, though, because Japan is still holding out. But they're losing desperately, to the point where they, I think they have holdings in Korea and some very close specific islands, but even Okinawa, which is very close to the Japan homeland, I think, has been taken by the Allies at this point. But I think they still have some part of Korea. Basically, the Allies are going to start attacking Japan, which obviously they do, with the atomic bombs. So it's the war is basically unwinnable, but Japan's philosophy is that they will never surrender and fight to the last man. So we're in a conundrum here. And obviously the atomic bombs, well, when we start the movie and no atomic bombs have been dropped, we see the first meeting and they're like, maybe we'll keep our options open to surrender. But obviously the Minister of War is like, absolutely not. And there's the Minister of the Navy also there. I don't think the Air Force has a minister that's on this like big panel of basically people that run Japan. It seems like the Emperor isn't too involved in these decisions, though he maybe has the final say. The early 1900s is an interesting point in history where it's like everybody's sort of run parliamentary, but we still have these kings, and in this case, Emperor of Japan around, who maybe could have the final say if they really decided to, but the people probably would rebel if that happened, though maybe not in Japan because they seem to hold this emperor in very high regard, but that's certainly the case in like England and stuff at the time. But nonetheless, it's an interesting place in the world because Japan still has like an emperor family, just like England still has their royal family, but I don't think they have any power. I think we're seeing the last day of the emperor having any power, in fact. Ha ha ha. In the longest day. See how that ties into the title? So they're having meetings, atomic bombs drop, and it increasingly puts pressure on them to surrender. They end up deciding that they will surrender. The Minister of War is sort of tentatively, and the Minister of the Navy are tentatively, like verbally agreeing to it in the meeting, but everybody sort of understands that there's going to be unrest in the army, and that these are the people that will most want to fight to the very last man, etc. And sort of then we follow a spring up of a rebellion from a few members of the army. And this is all supposedly very, very accurately based on a true story. It's one of the calling cards of this movie is that it's very accurate, almost too accurate, I think one of the Letterboxd reviews says. It goes into too many nuances and it makes the movie bad or something. But then, yes, we follow a few, I guess, relatively high-ranking officers trying to basically stage a coup. One of their part of the plans is kill the prime minister, put Tokyo under martial law, and declare that they're going to fight to the. Because basically they're all holding out hope, and the war minister at the beginning is holding out hope that if the Allies land on Japanese soil and then they win a big victory, then everybody in Japan's morale will go up both in the military and in the citizenry. You know what I'm trying to say? Will sort of jolt up and they'll have the power to repel them and go on to win the war. That's sort of their last gasp. Probably definitely not going to happen, especially since a big part of this is that Japan had a non-aggressions pact with the Soviet Union. I think dating back to a war they had pre-World War One that like Japan had surprisingly won, and that's like a little neat note in history or whatever. But they, in the very last days, turn on that, and I think we do see them attack a northern city in Hokkaido, which is the most northern island of Japan. I know these things because I watch wrestling, all right? Hokkaido is where Sapporo is, and New Beginnings in Sapporo in February. It's a big event for New Japan Pro Wrestling. I understand these things. But yes, they're fucked. But they're sort of wrestling with would we rather go out fighting or surrender, and sort of leave it up to fate and the Allies what happens, which opens a lot of very interesting ethical questions that are not really explored by the movie because they don't really care to, I guess. And with sort of the hindsight, even in 1967, of Japan sort of flourishing into this country, because especially towards the end of the movie, when even the Minister of War sort of accepts that they have to surrender, there's like this big thing of like the next few years are going to be very hard for Japan, but as long as everybody works very hard, every member of the citizenry, I said the word again, and the military or whatever, to rebuild Japan, then it can flourish. And obviously, if you're watching this in 1967, you're like, oh, we did that, and look where we are now, and look at how successful we are because we're the resilient Japanese people and we're the best, etc. So that sort of plays into the contemporary context when the movie came out, not necessarily to now or to the end of the war. But all interesting things. And then we sort of see there's basically, we get a MacGuffin. There's the Emperor records his surrender speech, and it's to go live through a fucking radio broadcast at noon the next day, and noon is when the longest day ends. That's the 24-hour period, and we see a lot of clocks ticking over throughout the movie. And basically, the rebels take over the Emperor's palace, which a lot of this stuff in this was like very interesting to me because I'm like, there's no way they actually take over the palace. Like, I would have heard more about this in fucking history class if there was a coup d'etat and they took over the Emperor's palace and started holding him hostage. But sure enough, that's what they basically do. I guess the fact that it failed sort of gets it not as prevalently re-explained in history classes. I bet there's like one line, like if somebody's doing, I bet in those like oversimplified videos or any like pop history YouTube video about the Second World War's conclusion, I bet they have like one line in there that you quickly miss. Like, after 2 atomic bombs and an attempted coup d'etat, the Japanese people finally surrendered, and fucking then the shill fucking whatever Raid Shadow Legends at the end of the video, cut to end screen, Patreon, and then end the video, and you're just like, oh, they surrendered. I already knew that. You didn't even hear the fucking part about the coup d'etat. Nonetheless, the movie's about it, and sort of the steps here, and especially when they go into the room where the recording is being hidden, and you're like, oh, no, they're gonna find it. I wonder how the fuck we still get to a peaceful resolution of this, but then they didn't find it. Spoiler alert. But yes, that's the thing that's the basic plot of the movie. Eventually, the plan is thwarted. Well, it's sort of a bunch of lies where the revolutionaries that we are following, they murder a high-ranking, I think the highest-ranking official in the Imperial Guard, who I think lives, like their whole unit lives at the palace, I think. But but they sort of then cover it up and say that he has given the go-ahead for the revolution. Not the revolution, the uprising of the coup d'etat, and they start lying to people, and suddenly their lives are sort of undone, and they're sort of kicked out of the palace. And then they commit suicide the next day, and that's the resolution of the plot. The Minister of War also kills himself. Lots of killing yourself at the end of the movie, and Japan surrenders, and that's basically how the movie ends. Nonetheless, I stopped watching a football game to come and record this, and now I'm curious about the score, and I'm not editing this out, so I'm going to look it up. But anyway, so yes, it's a very, oh my goodness, that's not a good score. And I have a Discord message. Somebody's probably asking why the fuck I'm in the collabs fucking chat. To record a video, you fucking idiot. But we've gone over the plot. Now, is the movie actually good? I think the answer is yes. Initially, like, I always make fun of Miller for doing this, but I did the highly controversial, the evil act of, I watched the movie in 2 parts on 2 separate days, and I hate doing this, but I was very tired. It was like 4 p.m., and I kept having to pause it because I was tired, and I had to process what was happening, and I'm slow at reading subtitles, so sometimes, and there's lots of big words in this movie, right? I had to look up a few words to be like, what does this word mean exactly? I can't remember any exact, I think rescript was one of them, because I'm like, what does rescript mean exactly? And sure enough, it just means like an official script. But a lot of ones where I'm like, I kind of get that. It's like every time you're reading a Game of Thrones chapter, there's always like 3 or 4 words in a chapter that you got to look up. Like, what is a dais again? Oh, that's the fucking shit like a lord sits on to look down at his fucking pissy subjects. Or there will be other big words. A lot of big governmental words in this fucking movie, and sometimes I had to look them up. Nonetheless, it took me like 2 hours to get through the first hour of the movie, or the first hour and a half. And then the next day I watched the next hour. And there you go, 2.5 hours watched. It definitely drags. You've sort of got to get into the flow, I think, of it. It's definitely slow. And in the end, I only gave it 3.5 stars. But the more I've thought about it in retrospect, I think I'm already bringing out the rose-tinted glasses, and I'm like, yeah, well, pretty good movie. You know, it was fun. There were some big emotional moments. I liked things. So that's my stance on it. You got to do a lot of work to watch this movie. I don't know if it's worth all that. But to keep up with the movie night, you got to watch it, chat. So, unlucky for you. It's definitely an interesting piece. Which of my dot points here do we want to run through? Fiercely conventional, I've got written down. Bad guys are ugly or crazy. Good guys are cool. Ida was really cool too, even though he was a bad guy. Though he's kind of the best of the bad guys, and repents at the end. This is definitely true. It is an extremely conventional movie in sort of every sense of the word. There was something I was working on. I think it might be this Chainsaw Man script, where I'm sort of trying to think of examples of things that are like incredibly conventional and incredibly sort of layer one in that context. Not in Minty's 3 layers context, but just in the context of very sort of by the numbers. You see, you get what you see what you get. What for idiom am I looking for here? But like the bad guys and the Harakawa, I think that was his name. It starts with a H. The main bad guy of the movie, the main uprising dude, is like giving these crazy, like, and his eyes get big and he's spitting everywhere, and it's like gross and bad, and he's the bad guy. Whereas like the prime minister is a good guy, and he's like this well-mannered, well-spoken, sort of elderly man. And you're like, man, that's pretty cool. I wish this dude respected me. And it's sort of like how everybody needs to be taken in by the audience. They are exactly portrayed, that there is no attempt at subversion or any sort of trickery or self-awareness of these sort of fiercely conventional tropes. And it's refreshing, and it all works. It's just very interesting. Especially in a world where artistically we are almost so far past it. It's like a relic of the past in a cute way. But yeah, like there's another, and how this plotline convenes was sort of confusing. I assume it's like a very famous like fact of history where there's like this general and he's got like no teeth, but he's got like ugly fake teeth and he was like screaming and he's like, yeah, this is a bad guy. It's like I feel like the biggest example for this is I remember YouTubers in the past, like when I was watching them when I was like 12. They would talk about how like in Star Trek there's like this episode of Picard where there's Picard gets separated from the group or something and he comes back and he's got a goatee. But then somehow it's revealed through the machinations of the plot that that's a evil clone of Picard and the real one is over here. But you know he's evil because he's got a goatee, and it's sort of one of those like evil people have goatees because they look weird and bad. It's like this dude has bad teeth, therefore he's evil and bad. Ugly fat woman is always going to be mean and evil in movies because they're ugly and fat and we don't like that. It's just sort of one of those things, and it's like, oh, we're just doing that. But this character, has like a bunch of like high school kids who he is like commanding around and pretending that he's like a commander with these weird little kids. And they're going to go and kill the prime minister and stop he has a specific phrase, like the cowardly diplomats in power or something who are trying to undermine the emperor by surrendering or something. And they do show up at the end and start shooting at places and burn down the prime minister's house and try to kill him. But yeah, that was just a weird, like a conventional, like that's a bad guy, I see him. And even the dude on the bad guy's side that's really cool, Ida, I think his name is more than just Ida, but they call him Ida sometimes in the movie. He gets some redemption at the end because he's cool and looks cool, and because we're all going to like him because he looks cool. Whereas the other ones commit suicide and fail and just go crazy as they do. But yeah, it's a perceptual thing, alright? It's a character design thing. It's cool. But yes, that was one of the talking points I had in this. Then my next stop point down sort of veers in a very different direction. They do an interesting thing to sort of keep... mystery isn't the right word. Anonymity is not the right word. To keep sort of that aura around the Emperor. You never actually see the Emperor. Like the frame will always... Like when he's recording his speech, we see the whole thing, and we even see him... Like it's not a thing to hold him in such reverence because he sort of has these minute, very human moments, and every time he speaks, he just seems like a normal dude. And he seems like he's like 40, so he's not that old. And he's like seems like a good guy too. He's like, yes, I will surrender so the Japanese people don't have to suffer or whatever. I don't care if I have no power anymore. Or the war general even cries at one point. And he's like, man, the Emperor just loves us all so much. Because a big thing and a big disconnect throughout this, we'll get back to this point. You never actually see the Emperor's face, is the point I was building up to there. Make sure I get back to it, chat. Remind me. Oh, I don't remember the tangent I was going to go on now. Oh, a big thing, I remember. A big thing in the movie is how, like, devoted they all are to the Emperor in every word. Which is a very foreign concept to me, and I think in most modern audiences, where it's sort of like an absolute devotion to sort of this monarchical figure. A monarch is what I'm trying to say here, which the Emperor basically is. Feels like such a, like, we're so ingrained, I think, especially in the 21st century, to value freedom and things like that. And to have a king telling you what to do, it's almost like we have to kill this fucking king. Like, what a piece of shit motherfucker, he's not going to tell me what to do. But everybody in the movie is, like, their number one thing when they get the demands from the Allies is sort of like, we have to have some counter, like, we have to send some demands back if we're going to surrender. And, like, number one on the list is that the Emperor stays in absolute power, and we all love the Emperor. I guess maybe it could be illegal to suggest otherwise and treasonous to suggest otherwise, but there's never, like, a hinting that the people don't care about the Emperor. And they're just like scheming around him. Like that is never like as the bad guys would sort of imply that the ministers are trying to do. Now, part of the point is that there is a thematic point being made here, obviously, that the army actually doesn't care about what the Emperor, because they're trying to say they're doing it in the name of the Emperor, in the name of the nation, but they really just don't want to like face the fact that they've lost or surrender. because that's a very unmasculine thing to do. I think reading it as toxic masculinity is a very sort of Western way to view it, because I think, is it Bushido or something? There is a very firm, especially in the imperial era of Japan, to sort of, like, this is everything to them, sort of their honor and dying like a warrior and samurai shit and stuff like that. I vaguely understand all these concepts in the most layman way possible. But this is obviously a very, very big thing, besides just the ego of admitting that you lost, though that is very much a part of it. So there's more there. And to just say, toxic masculinity or male, would sort of be redundant and would probably piss a lot of people off, and not even just for the anti-woke people or whatever. But it is whenever a character realizes, like, I feel like the war general has a moment where he realizes that he's not actually, like, he just is doing it for his pride. And it's sort of like the sort of part of the internal collapse there is that, oh no, I am betraying the emperor, what shame on me, sort of thing. So even though, like, from the outsider's perspective, you would point and go, haha, he doesn't actually care about the emperor. He actually does. He was just fooled himself into thinking he was doing it for that reason. The point is, they all really love the emperor and they all really love the nation. And these things are kind of foreign, I think, to most modern audiences, and even to me a little bit, even if I could sort of get in that mindset really easily. But there are scenes where this is stretched, where, like, the more I think about it, the more I don't think these scenes are sort of silly, where, like, the initial meeting they have with the emperor, where the emperor says, like, and it's like 50 guys in a room, and they're all very high-ranking ministers, and, like, old men and grizzled veterans of basically the war that's been going on and sort of everything. And the emperor, he doesn't even say surrender, but he says, like, for the betterment of my people, I will surrender. And they all start, like, weeping and falling to the ground and stuff like that. And it's such a foreign concept to me. But the more I think about it, the more they make sense. Like, I'm pretty sure, again, my layman understanding of the Japanese culture at the time is that they viewed themselves as absolutely superior. And this was absolute confirmation that they absolutely were not, like, surrendering. And I feel like you can sort of relate that. Like, what if your girlfriend was stolen by a better bloke or woman? You know, we're inclusive here. And sort of you have to face the fact that you're inferior or something. That can be upsetting. You might even cry about that. So it's sort of like, oh, I get it in this context. But also, I guess all of their lives and their entire, like, the surrender is not guaranteed to be peaceful at all. Like, Japan, again, from my layman understanding, has committed some pretty heinous war crimes, and China is part of the Allied forces at this point. So maybe, like, they just show up and start killing everybody, and especially all the ministers and the emperor and stuff like that, if they wanted to. Now, I'm pretty sure that's not what happened. But yeah, like, they could be uncertain about this, and they're just like, well, it's better to take that chance than to actually go to war and for everybody to die. So the more I think about it, the more... But in the moment, I was sort of having one of my anime moments where I'm like, a fucking dumb anime Thorfinn is crying like a bitch. What a fucking pussy. Stand up. In this movie, very against toxic masculinity, as I've just pointed out. I'm being very toxically masculine in the front of crying men. And I'm like, man. But they are, like, openingly weeping. And it's sort of the point where you're like, is this supposed to be funny? But it's obviously not. But the more I think about it, the more I like it. But also, I think part of that scene, tying into what we were talking about, is that they're so, like, humbled at the fact that the emperor would weep for them and be like, but he's the emperor and he's so obviously better than us. He shouldn't care about us or value us enough to surrender his position, etc., etc. But yeah, it's certainly interesting, and part of the appeal of going back to these super old movies, even though this is a super old movie about a even older period in time, the fact that it's only like 22 years or something removed is crazy. To be that close to World War II, crazy stuff, bro. But yeah, what was I saying? Oh, part of the appeal to going back to old movies is to sort of view people like this and their very, very vastly different sensibilities at the time and how they thought about things and how certain things could affect them in ways that have sort of become redundant to us as we've moved forward, I guess moved on because I don't necessarily, I'm not really necessarily interested in value judgment of how much we've grown to be better or something, because we don't care about these things anymore. Because I sort of fundamentally view sort of the human experience as the same throughout time, and sort of like, with like 2 shifts of context, we would all also be like this. Or even just like 80 years. Crazy. Hitler was running around 80 years ago. Like, it feels like, man, that should be like 5 million years ago. But yeah, a lot of like cross-generational conflict of ideas is very interesting, especially in how genuinely they are portrayed, when you're just like, man. It's sort of, you get this in Mad Men too, where like the Kennedy assassination happens and like people are openly weeping over like the president dying, and like I'm sitting there like, why does anybody care? But like people really did like love the president at the time. Like if Donald Trump or Joe Biden, like either of them died, like half the country would be celebrating unironically. And the other half, I don't think would cry. I guess the Trumples I could see crying. I don't think there's a lot of Joe Biden fans that would weep. And even somebody who I think of as more like universally loved, like Obama, like even then still there'd be some people celebrating. But it seems just like mass panic, and like people thought the world was going to end when the president died, because that shouldn't be able to happen to a president, I guess. And there is sort of a president worship throughout that show. It's just like, again, different sensibilities at the time of sort of, these people are in power, therefore they deserve sort of respect. Whereas we've sort of developed into a society where it's like, these people are in power, they deserve like disrespect, and they're who we blame for all our problems. And it is, because I think our more modern interpretation is probably more correct, but it seems like it's actually bad for us because like, so perhaps we were more productive in a time where we sort of just accepted these hierarchical things. Again, this is a completely different topic. That again, it is to the movie's credit that it makes you think about these things. It does add to the overall appeal and viewing experience, and because a lot of the value you get out of movies is thinking about them afterwards. And if you can lead into sort of these ethical or I guess these are philosophical conversations or thoughts about this, it is fun. But yeah, to get round back to the point, the Emperor is never shown very directly to sort of, and it is a neat, I don't know, it just is a narrative device that works, and you're just like, man, Emperors are cool, bro. We don't even get to see his face. And again, he has those minute moments where he's in the recording and he sort of asks like, should I project my voice more? And he's just asking the technicians. And it's like, oh, it's like a dorky thing I do before I start recording. The Emperor's just like me, bro. But that sort of juxtaposed with the worship they have of him. And again, the worship is never played off as like silly or stupid. It just is the thing. It is what's happening. It is never questioned. Because you could see sort of parodies of this contemporaneously that would be like the Emperor is twirling around his fucking cock or something, and they're like, oh, the majesty of the Emperor, and they're all bowing. Like, the point is that they will ignore anything from the Emperor or whatever. None of it is played like that in the movie, and again, it's sort of refreshingly interesting in that manner. But yeah, it's like you'll see him recording, you'll see his whole body, but like the mic will be in his face or something, and you don't see him, and that's just an interesting narrative device, the voice that works. I just said the crying is my next up point, the pride in a nation, sadness and defeat, actual loyalty to the Emperor. I feel like we've talked about all these things. I don't want to talk about Anami's farewell. Look, I said his name because I didn't think about it and I said it correctly. Yet, I don't think. I am fucking recording, right? Everything is going swell. The recording is happening. The mic is picking up. I think we're doing good. How long have we been on? 40 minutes nearly. I thought this was going to be a short one. And this is part of my realization that maybe this movie is better. Maybe we should give it 4 stars. I was actually thinking about this. Fucking Gaslight has 4 stars. Is that a 4-star movie? Is that better than Japan's Longest Day? And to correct that, do we give Japan's Longest Day 4 stars? Or Gaslight 3.5 stars? I will think about this more and update. You better be following the fucking letterbox chat. I'm pretty sure it's linked in the description. To find out these highly attentive things about movies you probably haven't seen. So I'm going to skip the Anami's. I said it right when I wasn't thinking. Farewell point. Not knowing that there was a coup and the coolness of great scene. These are sort of individual scenes, but I kind of lightly touched on that already where I was like, I didn't know there was a fucking coup. So the plot was very surprising to me, and it's sort of like, well, it can't go any further than this. And it can't go any further than this, and sort of having that moment repeatedly throughout the movie, but it actually like defiling that. And that's a very personal, like if you go in knowing all the history, which I assume a lot of the Japanese people would go into the movie, so this isn't like an intentional viewing experience that the Japanese people would have at the time. Easy for me to say. But yeah, so that was a very personal experience for me. And it probably would have been for you if you had watched it without watching the review first. But yeah, it's just an interesting viewing experience. These are sort of miscellaneous notes I got left, and so kind of trying to group all the, I think, are the coolest moments of the movie together. There's a point where the Navy director shows up, and the Minister of the Navy, and he's apparently the dude that thought up of the kamikaze concept, which again, now that you think about it, and you're not like a 12-year-old being taught this in history class, you're like, man, how the fuck did they get people to kamikaze themselves? But it goes into this Japanese cultural thing at the time that dying an honorable death is good, and fighting to the last man, etc. But the Navy minister shows up and he's like, no, the war is not over. If we can just get 2 million kamikaze planes and like 500,000 kamikaze ships, we can win the war. And he's just like, if 2 million people sacrifice themselves. And his mindset makes complete sense because he's like, we're going to fight to the last man regardless. Let's just have brave volunteers, 2 million of them kamikaze, and we'll win, and we'll deplete the whole Navy and or Air Force of the Allies, and we'll be fine. It's like, man. And the fact that he was just doing it in numbers, it reminded me of the weirdest thing, Chad. I don't think I've explained this properly because I think this is a profound point about how the human mind works in terms of numbers and how we don't actually process them correctly, and how he can just say 2 million kamikaze planes. That's like, there's like 2 people in those planes, or maybe there's just 1, but even so, 2 million Japanese men, and they're like, there's like 4 million adult aged men right now, or like from like 18 to 35 or whatever you accept in the military, and all we have to do is spend half of them, and you're like, man, that's 2 million people, and that's going to do detrimental damage to the nation in the future because they won't have a workforce, etc., etc. But yeah, it's just like, oh, what it reminded me of. It reminded me of Film Buff a long time ago. He made a video where he was like, all I need is half of my subscribers to give me $1 on Patreon, and I could do this full time, and we could get 1 million views. Like 1 million. I can get 1 million reaction series out and please everybody. And it's like, why wouldn't my audience want this? And I sort of, as a YouTuber, you sort of have those things of like, I've got like 8,000 subscribers, and 4,000 of them, who I assume will like me, give me $1 on Patreon, I'd be making $4,000 a month, I'd be rich, I'm off to the promised land. And sort of you play games with yourself, but you're like, of the 8,000 people that have subscribed to you, like maybe 500 of them keep up with you. The rest of them have forgotten about you, or YouTube has let them forget about you. And it's probably the first one, even though you would like to blame it on the second one. And it's sort of like, and with him in the Patreon thing, it's like, because I remember watching that, and I'm like 15 at the time, and I don't got any money, and I'm like, I bet a bunch of his subscribers are also 15, and they don't have any money either. So it's sort of like a misread of the audience or a misread of the situation through numbers, and like, shouldn't this be simple? And you sort of, part of this is not just the numbers thing, but projecting your mindset onto people and being like, well, they'll just go with it. Like, I would give $2 to my favorite creator to have this happen, so everybody would. And it's sort of like this minister, who doesn't seem to be portrayed as a coward or anything, would totally be down to kamikaze himself. And he would obviously think that everybody in Japan would also have this mindset. So 2 million kamikaze planes is completely like, yes, we can win. Like, he's making a passionate speech about how this is the way to the future and how we can win the war and survive, and not have the empire die, which is what they basically read a surrender as. And it's just, because part of it is like the shock of like, man, he wants to kill 2 million people, of his own people, to win the war. And it's like, man, that's fucking crazy and sick. And then you sort of think about it more, and it's, the mindset is very interesting, because I assume this actually happened, and this minister did actually propose this. And it's another like history factoid that they've thrown into the movie. But yeah, that was another interesting thing. This is another scene mention. And then this is about violence. Now, again, a lot of the movie, I think about this a little. Well, I'll talk about that in a second. Apparently, a bit of history about this. Kurosawa, who's the big samurai Japanese film dude from the 60s, who there's every frame of painting videos about and everybody loves and worships, though I've never seen any of his movies. I wish your pants looked stay instead, because I'm a real smart boy. I don't like action movies. I like talking about shit in boardrooms. Apparently, he was originally supposed to direct this movie, but then he left the company or something, and they hate each other ever since. There's like a whole history there. Toho, I'm assuming, is the company, because again, this is Toho's 35th anniversary special or something. Now, the other director that did this is apparently another action director of the time who's like compared to Kurosawa all the time. The point is, there's like a one action scene in the movie, and the sort of starkness of it, there's a lot of blood, and it looks like sort of like those samurai movie clips you see in those every frame of painting videos. And I think the juxtaposition works. It sort of comes out of, you're like, whoa, this movie about talking is now like that dude just got decapitated and blood squirted everywhere. Now, they do have a lot of like kind of goofy blood splurts. Now, come to think about it, I don't know what it actually looks like when somebody like stabs somebody with a sword, but it squirts up and out everywhere. I'd assume it would like drip down, and there would be an initial squirt, like in Game of Thrones, where sort of like that's the like when people get stabbed through, the blood doesn't squirt everywhere, but there is a lot of blood. And in my head, I assume that that's more realistic, but I have no fucking idea what it looks like when some cunt gets cut and fucking off with a sword. So maybe that could be like make it look silly or something. But it is definitely like there's sudden violence, and it's like, we're not violent here. This is like a real life movie where we're all talking about our problems. And this is actually another thing that I think it captures sort of a human experience thing where you're sort of like, I've been thinking about this a lot recently where like violence is real. Like somewhere somebody is getting murdered right now, like unironically. And that's kind of like crazy. They just got stabbed and they're like bleeding everywhere. And like if you stabbed yourself, could bleed everywhere. And sort of there's like a disconnect where you don't really ever think about that in your day-to-day life. And the fact that that could happen, like at any moment. And that like war actually happened. Like, and there's war happening now in like Ukraine and stuff. People are getting blown up. It's sort of just a disconnect where you don't think about it. And you're like, nah, that violent shit isn't real. That's shit from like movies. And I think the sudden appearance of it here is sort of part of the, like, you never think about this. Like, even there is some off-putting scenes where the Minister of War does have a sword on him in all of the boardroom meetings, and I'm like, at some point, is he going to kill one of these dudes? And it's just sort of the unease of him even having the sword there. Now, he never actually uses it. Well, he does on himself at the end of the movie, but that was like a tacit reminder of like, people could die here. These are high-level political meetings about a war and a surrender. Like, people could die here very easily. Through either revolt or coup d'etat. But yeah, the Imperial Guard leader dude gets killed, and there's blood everywhere, and it's a sudden violent thing. It's the only real violent thing in the movie. There are other gunshots and stuff, but gunshots are fake. Guns don't actually exist in my mind. I never seen one. I've never seen one shot. I've never seen anybody get shot. So I'm like, of course, that's some fake movie shit. But like, the blood stuff, it kind of cut to the heart of like the realization that isn't that far off. And I've been thinking about that, especially more as I've gotten a real job and I've seen sort of people be sort of evil in public to each other or to people that don't deserve it. And it sort of has made me think more about like, if this turned violent, these are the mindsets people would have. And I don't know, that's just sort of something I've been thinking of. I don't think I've connected it. And I think if you haven't also been having this experience of thinking about this recently, you'll be completely lost in this moment. But that comes part and parcel with any fucking secondary ENT content or stream content you fucking consume from me, alright? You know these fucking tangents and how they go. But yeah, there's a sudden shift where there's one scene with a lot of violence and a lot of blood, and it's interesting. Now, I guess this is also brought in later when we do have the seppuku, the suicide scenes, by way of sword and stabbing yourself. You know what we're talking about. Especially with the war, Minister of War. I always want to say war director. I don't know why. Because we're talking about directors of movies. I don't know. The Director of War, that's kind of a cool title. Minister of War is probably cooler, though. he is sort of framed as the good guy throughout the movie and who we see the most internal conflict with, because he is sort of drawn in both directions but ultimately decides to side with the surrender, though he commits suicide at the end, which is an interesting point. But I think I don't want to talk about that and the implications of that, because I did do some reading, and I often do this, where I'll do some Wikipedia reading, sometimes while I'm watching the movie, which is very bad. Now, I didn't want to specifically look up the coup d'etat and the result of it, because I wanted to experience it through the movie. But I did this with Blonde, if we can go back to the first ever movie night, where I was sort of reading Marilyn Monroe shit as the movie was happening. I was like, oh, I didn't know she married some baseball dude. What the fuck is that? But yeah, and I've since read a little bit about the suicide attempt and some of the interpretations of his suicide note particularly, and it was interesting to compare that to how it's portrayed in the movie, etc. But we'll talk about that in a second. Some of the very standout scenes, I guess we'll avoid the war director dude, the Minister of War, fuck me, and we'll talk about the other stuff. There's, they sing a war song that I think I've heard before, probably in some video about anime and connecting it back to something. It might have even been in that Forest basically a movie. That Forest documentary about the MMA dude, the Gracie killer or whatever the fuck. He didn't kill no Gracies. The Gracie Slayer or something. The Japanese dude that beat all the Gracies in MMA fights. And Forrest tied it into fucking spirit stuff from World War II, etc. And there's a song, and it's a chant, and it sounds cool, but its lyrics are like terrifying, where it's like a war song and an imperial war song, and there's like all these women and children gathered to sing off basically a bunch of kamikaze pilots, and they're all cheering and stuff, and it's like, man, they're all going to kill themselves in the last battle of the war that's almost completely pointless. And they're getting cheered off and sung off. One of the lines particularly is like, I wish I could send my mother a picture of the like glorious sinking ship of the enemy or something. That's not the exact line. But that one stuck with me. And like, because you see like an air guard, and it's not, there's like one air guard that's like, I will never surrender. It's a different, I think they might be on the same base, but there's another commander dude that's giving like a speech beforehand. And again, he's not sort of played as a crazy person, but like, you see like the shots of like these 18-year-olds that are all going to fly these fucking planes and kamikaze some people, and they've all got the most sullen looks on their face, because obviously they're thinking and having second thoughts about, but it's not like they're sweating and they're like, oh, well, what the fuck are we doing? But they're all extremely stoic and mean looking, and it's like, oh, what a moment. Like, what are the emotions like in that moment? How do you convince yourself to do that in the moment? Because they are all convinced, and they all definitely believe it. So it's not even like sort of a sympathy thing, which I feel like a lot of anti-war thing. It's like, like you can sort of, and even if you've ever played sports or even ever gone to a sports game and been cheering on your team, and somebody will make a big tackle, and it's sort of like you're exhausted, but then it sort of lifts the whole team, and sort of you feel like you could conquer the world or do anything in that moment. I even get that moment like when I'm thinking about scripts or something, and I crack the code, because I usually am pacing when I do that, because I'm a fucking crazy person. And you sort of get that indestructible feeling. It's like, man, is that what they're feeling now? Is like thousands of like sort of, and it's sort of the a lot of military stuff is like, oh, part of the glory of it is that everybody sort of respects you, and even to this day you have Remembrance Days and Anzac Days, or I think it's called Memorial Day in America or whatever, where like everybody 100 years on pays respects to all the brave men and women that died or whatever. You know how it goes. And the fact that sort of infinite glory is something you get, is that what you're hyped up on? It's just sort of interesting. It sort of calls ethically those practices into question, to whether or not this could be used, and this sort of legacy is continually used as sort of a propaganda tool to recruit people for the military, or things like that. It's just it's just an incredible scene, I think, of them all leaving, and the commander giving sort of the salute, and just the fierce look on his face, as again, he's completely convinced what he's doing is right, but like he knows, and there's a sullenness to there of like, man, they're all going to kill themselves, and it's on you, but it's also the good thing, and sort of that internal conflict. I don't know. There's a lot of very interesting questions when it comes to wartime stuff that I think I'm fascinated with. We haven't even really talked about the ethical questions yet. But that's one of the very standout scenes of the, maybe the standout scene of the movie, but another one is the war general's farewell. And I love the expositional manner of this scene, where basically they've all signed off. Like, this is like an hour and a half into the movie. They've all signed off on the script. And it's like this big victory moment. And this actually ties into the other scene that I have written down, because they're actually the same scene. And how cool it is. There's also a narrator throughout this, because this is... I guess we should have talked about this from the beginning. This is a docudrama. So it's shot a little differently, and there's a narrator as if it's like a documentary, like a history documentary that comes in every once in a while. And it's sort of like dramatic recreations, but more cinematic. I don't know if I've ever seen a docudrama that wasn't just like a documentary with like 10 or 12 insert shots of an emperor in a dude in an emperor costume posing, or something like you'll see in sort of cheap but good ancient Egypt documentaries or something. But yeah, so this is one of the points where the narrator comes in. But they've all basically, you think like, oh, we've won. Like, oh, the emperor's going to surrender, everything's going to be good, nobody else has to die. And the war minister has signed up on this. He has a scene previously where he basically goes to the army barracks or whatever and announces that he is not going to do the uprising. Or he basically says that he signed the surrender document. And we see our bad guys basically start their plan at that point, where one of them like starts very loudly screaming and weeping, and he runs off, and him and his 3 friends decide to try and do the coup d'etat. So he's sort of like, he's basically, and you think he's just going to get killed there, because he actually has a line where he's like, if you doubt my leadership or whatever, slay me where I stand. And he's like surrounded by dudes, and he's like got his hand on his sword, and it's like, oh, maybe he wants to go out fighting his own men and it'll be glorious or whatever. Because again, a big thing throughout this is like having a glorious death. But he survives that, and he ends up back at the meeting, and then they finalize everything, and then they sort of have this moment where they all leave the room, but they don't want to like leave the place yet because it could be dangerous, etc. And they all go to sit in sort of like a rest area or whatever, and they're all sitting down, and some of them are smoking and some of them are drinking. It's not like celebratory, because they're like, oh, they're so fucking tired because they've been up for like 24 hours discussing this, and it's obviously one of the most monumental decisions in human history. And they're all sort of relaxing, and the war minister, basically as an audience member, you're like, oh, the war minister did it, because you kind of like him the whole time, but he's kind of doing the wrong thing, but then he does the right thing. You feel such relief. And then he walks over to the other sort of main character, who is the Minister of Foreign Affairs or something, who's been the good guy since the beginning. He's like, surrender is good, we'll save the most people. But he's like a blue chipper, like, oh, this is the good guy, right? We understand. He's not as cool as the dude in internal conflict right now. But the war minister walks over to him and like, to say he apologizes sort of undercuts how cool it is. He's like, he goes over to him and he's like, I should have humbled myself or whatever. And they have a moment where they're like, thank you. And they're like, man, what a dilemma we just went through. And they sort of have this moment of understanding. It's like, oh, this is fucking sick. And then he goes into the prime minister, who is in like a different room, and he knocks on the door. And again, there's been scenes previously where they've had a bit of tension, but it's very clear all the ministers very much respect the prime minister, and he's sort of older than them, and he's really cool looking. So we like him too. And they have this big moment where it's like, everything I've done has been for everything I've argued, and my opinions that I've expressed have been for the nation. I have no other agenda. The other agenda would obviously be say you're going to do this, but secretly plan a coup d'etat. But he admits to the prime minister, like, who has probably been suspecting him, that he might do this because he's being torn in different directions. It's very clearly like a father-son relationship here, and he's like, I had no other agenda, I apologize. And then he gives him like a gift, and he's like, a soldier sent me these like cigars from the front lines in some like distant land, and he gives them to the prime minister. And then he walks out, and like, you're on like emotions high right now. You're like, oh, he did all the right things, and now he's reconciled with all of his friends, and he's like, oh, what a moment. And then the prime minister, after he leaves the room, has like a line. He's like, Ayanami-san or whatever, you have a like a beautiful or a strange way of saying farewell or something. And you're like, oh no, he's gonna kill himself, and it's sort of this very somber, and you don't have that oh no moment, but it's a very somber, like touching sort of like it's a sad, melancholic twist to a scene that was going so well, but it works so well. It's such a great scene. And yeah, it's just like, oh, so sad. And we see his suicide later, and he actually doesn't die for like another hour in the movie, though he isn't in it that much after that. But it's just like, oh, what a scene. What a scene. So that's probably the best scene in the movie, even more so than the singing off the planes with the creepy / cool Imperial Japanese war song. But there's also a part in that scene where they're all like undoing their ties and sweating and being like, oh, it's finally over. But then narrator kicks in and it says like, these 24 men, they've all disagreed or whatever, but finally for the first time today, they're all on the same page, and they all agree that this has been a very long day and that they're all so tired. But little did they know, their longest day had just begun. And it's like, oh, fuck, we still got more movie left. And it's like, oh, because you've just hit like midnight, I think. So you could be fooled into thinking the movie is wrapping up here, but no, the day isn't from midnight to midnight, it's from midday to midday, Japan's longest day. And so we've got another 12 hours of coup d'etat stuff, and then we cut to the coup d'etat starting, and it's like, oh, what a scene. Oh, great movie, let's give it 4 stars, fuck it. I don't know. I feel like it's already due for a rewatch, though I'm not too enthusiastic about doing one. I think going back to rewatching it and knowing where it goes, etc., would be interesting. But we're probably going to stay with 3.5 stars right now. I don't know. The average is 3. Do I really think this is worse than most people do? Because the average is 3.7. Is it 4 stars? I don't know. We'll think more about this afterwards. But those are the scenes. Do I have any other notes? Oh, the ethical question. I guess the ethical questions is all we have to go over. How long have we been going? 1 hour and 1 minute. This is actually cool. I thought this was going to be a shorter one, but the fact that we're over an hour is cool. In this situation where you don't know what the Allies are going to do, is it ethical to continue the war or to stop the war? Now, they have more atomic bombs. And the atomic bombs get detonated in the first 7 minutes of the movie, and that does sort of escalate things, especially when the US's stance, I'm pretty sure at the time, was that we will continue doing this if you do not surrender. Now the ethics of that are also questionable, and also a very interesting discussion of is it worth it to force the surrender? Because ultimately you probably are saving lives, but you are killing innocent lives, but you're almost always killing innocent lives in war. Is there ever a justifiable war? The answer is certainly yes to that question. When you're being invaded, you're probably definitely morally allowed to fight back. But what if to prevent further invasions, once you've won that war, do you then invade said land of the other nation to ensure that they never do that again, and then you're killing innocents on their side? It's interesting. Ethical questions. Is it ethical to prioritize the well-being of people in your nation over the others? We talked about some of these questions in Attack on Titan. The way we talked about them was R-worded. You know what I mean. Very stupid. We were all stupid about it. But yes, there is a very interesting ethical question of we sort of know that it all turns out fine for Japan, right? They're going strong today. I don't think there were mass executions of innocent people when the Allies, what do you call it? Not infiltrated, because they were welcomed in. Well, not welcome, but allowed in. During occupation, I think is what I'm trying to say. And ultimately, I guess the restructuring to get rid of an emperor and sort of have a more democratic system in Japan, which I'm pretty sure they have a pretty democratic system over there, probably was better for the future Japanese people, I guess. But we've seen other attempts to democratize places in the Middle East end horribly. So I don't know if we're signing off on that ethically. But yeah, it's interesting. With the outcome uncertain, it's sort of to reduce it to a more not realistic example, but an interpersonal dynamic. If somebody jumps the fence at your house, are you allowed to kill them because they could be breaking into your house, and if they break in and something goes wrong, they could kill your family? The answer to that is probably no. Now, if somebody jumps the fence and they have a gun on them, now we're starting to get more murky. These fucking allied troops are going to show up with some fucking guns. It's sort of, you continue doing it until like, well, if they jump the fucking fence with a scream mask on and they have a knife and they say, I'm going to kill your family on your shirt, well, then you're almost certainly allowed to preemptively kill them. But sort of where the line is exactly drawn is a far more interesting ethical question. If somebody's running at you to punch you, are you allowed to ethically kill them? Because if they land a very specific punch, they could kill you. Probably not, but probably, I don't know. These are hard questions, and how to get one that, what do you call it, is analogous to this situation is very interesting, because you are surrendering. You are allowing them to basically do whatever they want. Now, you sort of assume what's in their best interest is probably not just mass slaughter, so that probably won't happen, but yeah, it's just sort of like an interesting, and the uncertainty of that, when you could, like, if it was the case that they came and just started slaughtering and you could have fought from a better position previously before you would let them in, that'd probably be a pretty deep regret. But yeah, there's a lot to think about there, and a lot that can be interesting. And the movie obviously makes you think about that. Now, obviously, the movie has a very, the movie is pretty pro-surrender, and it's pretty obvious. I think Japan is probably, in retrospect, pretty pro-surrender. I don't know if there's a big political contingent in Japan right now that's like, man, we should have never surrendered. Imperialism was great, etc. And obviously, I think America didn't do anything too bad when they got there, at least to, the mass population. It wasn't America, it was the Allies, right? They say British, Soviet, and Chinese things all throughout. Don't Americanize everything here. But yeah, those are various interesting conversations, I think, that you can all glean from a situation like this and sort of understand the plight of the people in this scenario. On top of all the I got a fucking notification on my phone. On top of all the personal conflict that we've got going on here. Hey, I didn't even know. The Minister of War is who's on screen, and the Minister of Navy is to the side there. But I think that's all we've got to say about Japan's longest stay. Would I recommend it? I think so. I think that's what I've come to the conclusion of. I think I've talked myself into liking it a little bit more. What an interesting piece. I'm very glad I watched it, even if it wasn't the most entertaining thing minute to minute. Next week will be episode 10 of Movie Night, and it will be The Crucible featuring Elite RE. How exciting, everybody. Greatest movie of all time, with the greatest orbiter of all time, Elite RE, it'll be our first full Elite RE movie night since the Lighthouse debacle where I forgot to record, or I was recording but we were muted or something fucked up, and we talked about it for like an hour, and then we only got 15-minute video afterwards. What a sad day. That was Kyle Entertainment's longest day. Movie Night's longest day of turmoil and crisis. We didn't know where we would go. But interestingly, after episode 10, I think we are going to be shifting how we do things on Movie Nights to where we will probably be covering more movies per episode. And I think I want to do it through like a connective thing where it won't be like 3 random movies we cover, but like I think episode 11 is going to be like the first 2 or 3 Satoshi Kon movies. I think there's only 5 of them. But it would be like, we're doing Satoshi Kon movies, or we're doing the Star Wars fucking sequels or prequels or the original series, and we're doing the Hunger Games movies for this one, or I think mostly it'll be grouped by director or by series like that. But if it's like, there are other ones where, because I've sort of started grouping them in my head, I actually wrote some down, some groupings. There's like a female horror, like a modern female horror movie. There's like a few movies, like I think Saint Maud and Cyber, and there's a few other ones where it's like, these are all on my watch list, and they could be grouped together in an interesting fashion. But yeah, I think that's what we'll probably be doing moving forward. Now, the problem with that is that I have to watch more movies before I can record things. But I think, because what we were doing so far in the plan was, it's like the 1001 Nights one, where it was like, I could like sporadically do the next movie in that spiritual series, and then the next one later, or I could have done them all at once and gotten them out of the way, because, I don't know, for whatever reason, it's more satisfying in my brain to get a bunch of them out of the way, to be like, rather than doing one movie at a time, where it would be like, well, what the goal is, like, oh, I want to see a lot of this director's stuff. So to just do, like, Perfect Blue, I think, is the first Satoshi Kon movie, and then 15 episodes later do what's the second one? Millennium Actress, I think, is the second one. To do that, and then it's like 3 years before we actually have watched a bunch of Satoshi Kon stuff. Where I think it might be better to just do a bunch of them at once. Like, we would probably do, like, because he's only got 5, we would split it into 2, and maybe we would split those 2 episodes, like, one could be episode 11 and one could be episode 19 or something, and we'd have a little bit, because also you want to keep variety for the audience, I guess, but also for me. I don't know if I want to watch every one of his movies in a row, especially if they're similar. Like, you want some variety in there, so yeah. We'll be changing up how movie night goes, I think. But stay around, stay tuned. Hopefully this continues to be a little bit more consistent moving forward. But yes, the next one is The Crucible. You've all got to watch The Crucible. We're watching the Daniel Day-Lewis version, the Winona Ryder version from the 90s. I think it's from the 90s, that I've watched previously in English class. Oh, I think it's also going to be the first rewatch, which is also clever because it's episode 10, and it's like, that makes the numbers work better in my brain. It doesn't make me feel icky. If I had just done if episode 9 or episode 12 was suddenly our first rewatch, that wouldn't be significant and that would be stupid. But then going forward after this, we're allowed to let the floodgates open and do some more rewatches, which could be interesting. But The Crucible I haven't watched in like 7 years, so it's going to be like, oh, it's basically a fucking new watching. It's not like we're watching the Ava movies again, which we already have videos of on the second channel. They don't test me. I'll fucking watch those rebuilds with Elite RE or Mr. R if they want to. Since I don't think both of them have seen Ava but haven't seen those. Or even Bacon, I'm pretty sure he's seen Ava but he hasn't seen those. Don't talk me into rewatching the fucking rebuilds. I'll do it on a second's notice, chat. I'll upload a 4th and 5th fucking review of them on the second channel. I guess it would be 5th because there's 4 movies. Nonetheless, I'll explain all in due time. You'll see how things unfold. With that being said, we're done with Japan's Longest Day. On to The Crucible. Support links in the description below. Thanks.